Hello, Cleveland. Let's rock and roll with Rollin' Rats.
Maybe if you don't want to talk, you could just listen.
Alright gang, what is happening? I'm Mal Foster and you are listening to, from a personal standpoint, probably, if not definitely, the most serious episode of your third favourite above average but infinitely curious podcast, Dimed Out. This week there is no faffing about, no silly interludes.
He's reached the crossroads. For after 36 years of cod and chips, peas and chips, and boiled carrots twice on Tuesdays, he's decided to fling discretion to the winds and indulge his jaded palate in an orgy of exotic vegetables. John Bull is on his way to market.
Well, alright, with the exception of that, but apart from that, the rest of this episode is serious. I swear. In some ways, it is the most straightforward episode I've ever sat down to record, and in other ways, it really isn't straightforward at all. I have been teasing this episode, or this thing I'm about to talk to you about, for some time this season, here and there, with the promise that I would eventually get round to it. Well, promise fulfilled, for this is me finally getting round to it. Back in November, about a week or two maybe before Thanksgiving, I started feeling off, for lack of a better term. It started on a Sunday, a really tired Sunday, like I was just done. And I mean, I'm talking like dragging my ass through the entire day tired. And as the afternoon progressed, it stopped feeling like it was tiredness brought on by undersleeping. It was more reminiscent of when I had COVID back in the summer. That level of super fatigue, not just, oh, I could do with a few more hours of kip, just like wiped out, tired. So afternoon turns to evening and I receive a text from a colleague telling me that she's tested positive for COVID. So, putting this information together with the way that my body was feeling, I considered, okay, maybe, it's still within the window where I shouldn't be getting COVID, but it is really, as I say, reminiscent of back then, the super fatigue. And so I take a test, an at-home COVID test, only for it to come back negative. So, I figure, maybe it's a delayed response, because I honestly can't think of anything else it could be at this point. So I take another one again in the morning, and once again, negative, no COVID. I was still tired, like drudging my way through a swimming pool of treacle tired at this point. But with 2 neggies under my belt and no other symptoms whatsoever, I felt okay to carry on as normal. Just, keep an eye on things and see if I sense any progression. So I get ready for the day and I get everything sorted and I go to the gym before I go to work. Or rather, I attempted to go to the gym before I went to work. I fudged through a partial warm-up at best, and then I started a pretty typical high-intensity interval routine that I've been doing. One that I know pretty much off by heart, and from the jump, it was obvious that something wasn't right. Something's up here. Every movement felt like a chore, and I was struggling to remember what came next. As I said, I know this pretty much off by heart, but I'm struggling to remember what comes next. I'm struggling to keep up with how many reps I've done of things. I am just, my coordination is really wonky. I am finding it hard to keep balance, and just something is not right. So less than 10 minutes into this attempt, I call it quits, which is very unusual because I will typically just power through as best I can. But at this point, I'm just realizing like nothing's doing here. Nothing's doing at all with this. So I had a shower and get changed and then head off to work. At this point, with an energy drink in hand, I am just exhausted already. And the day is just starting, or hasn't even started yet, truly. And my concentration just gone, absolutely fractured. A colleague suggested when I got into work that I just take a sick day and that I have myself the day to rest. So, taking her advice, I jump in my office, send off the appropriate emails, and then I ganyam for a full-on duvet day. Ganyam is Cumbrian for going home, by the way. If you didn't know, you do now. You're welcome. So, yeah, ganyam, get into bed, and I'm just like, this is clearly what I need. I have clearly been doing too much, and I've burnt out, or, something's gone awry, and this is my body telling me, you need to rest. Similar to when I got COVID, it's almost as if my body was like applying the handbrake for me because I wasn't about to do it myself. So that's what I'm thinking still at this point. It's COVID, maybe, or it's something within that's just like, yeah, you just need to stop for a bit. So after a full-on duvet day, plenty of rest, plenty of sleep, and the tiredness subsided a little bit the next day, only to come back, though, in waves over the next couple of days. Outside the cyclical rounds of fatigue and super fatigue creeping back in, other symptoms start to emerge. One of the main symptoms being a massive amount of brain fog and just, continued lack of concentration, if any concentration. Regular tasks that are done almost automatically, instinctively, took me 2, 3, 4, 5 attempts to do, and I had to stop and kind of recalibrate and revise how to do things that I know how to do easily. My balance in general was off. I talked about how it was off in the gym. It was kind of off just in general. I noticed that I was wobbling a little bit. And then there was the night driving. My commute home from work in the dark over those next couple of days was a struggle, to say the least. That's putting it mildly. My vision was blurry and out of focus, and honestly, this is where things start to become genuinely concerning. Because anything to do with my vision, I freak out a little bit and catastrophize and instantly assume that this is the first stage to me going blind. Yeah, I hold on from doing anything about it for a while. It's that stupid male thing of, oh, it's okay, I'll power through, it'll write itself out in a couple of days. It didn't. The vision was still knackered for a couple of days. The thing is, the vision stuff, the stuff with my vision was reminiscent of a period in my life about 7, maybe 8 years ago. It was dubbed an infection, but I, being a completely unqualified doctor with readily available access to the internet, self-diagnosed myself as having labyrinthitis. Now, I'm not going to explain what that is. I don't have the time. You've got the resources. You've got a computer in your pocket. You've probably got a computer right now in your hands or close to your hands. If you want to dive into labyrinthitis, be my guest. So, yeah, I diagnosed myself as having labyrinthitis, or at least that's how I remember it. And I honestly, it's that weird grey area of, I'm not sure if my self-diagnosis is an actual memory or it's a memory I've coloured in to fit the narrative over time. If I've told myself enough times that it was me that said I had labyrinthitis, at this point I cannot truly, honestly, hand on heart say that I did diagnose myself with labyrinthitis or the doctor did. It doesn't matter because this is not labyrinthitis. What does matter is that period of my life was hateful, severely hateful. It was like I had been caning it the night before and it was a hangover that lasted for a fortnight. I just had no sense of balance. Vision was not in sync. It was everywhere, and my tummy was beyond dicky. I felt nauseous all the time for those 2 weeks. Anyway, what I was experiencing at the back end of November was eerily similar to this, except in November I was, as I said, struggling with concentration, and one of the other symptoms was I was developing this really odd sort of dull taste in my mouth. It wasn't bitter, it wasn't acidic, it was just, the way I described it was like my taste buds had been flattened out. Having struggled with the drive home on the Wednesday of that week, I came home really flustered and confused and kind of just upset by the fact that I know something's not right, but I don't know what it is. And that is when my wife noticed that one of my pupils was much bigger than the other and that I wasn't blinking in sync. It would go one eye closed and then the other. One eye closed, then the other. I can only imagine, because obviously I can't see my own eyes blinking, but it must have been very weird. Oh, and at this point, I was starting to feel what I referred to as a lagging reaction, as if the frame rate of the world was juddering. So, with all of this, without hesitation, my wife, obviously concerned, drove me to the hospital, and that's where this whole shit odyssey really takes flight. All right, so I go to hospital on the Wednesday night after putting off the fact that something's not right and I should go and see about it, and then things keep mounting up, and then eventually we get to that breaking point and my wife's like, nope, off to the hospital we go, get in the car. So I get in the car and we go. Arrive at the hospital at about 7:30, and, I go through explaining the symptoms and issues I've been having to a nurse, then somebody else, and then a doctor, having to explain what brings me here about 3 or 4 separate times whilst waiting to be seen properly, as it were. And at the time, as previously mentioned, I've still got one pupil bigger than the other, and I'm still unable to blink in unison. There's also a slight facial drop happening on my mug. One side isn't as firm as the other, one side is droopy, and so the phrase Bell's palsy is thrown out there. And that is a consideration. Maybe this is Bell's palsy. Again, I'm not going to get into that and unpack what that is and explain it. You've got, the resources if you want to dive into it. Be my guest. So Bell's palsy is mentioned, and then we go into a cycle of waiting. There's a bit more waiting, even more waiting, and then eventually I have myself a CAT scan. There's a little bit more waiting after the CAT scan, then a little bit more waiting after the CAT scan. At this point, it's been about 5 hours since I initially arrived. I wish I could have skipped through the night as fast as I'm skipping through it here in retrospect. That would have been nice, but it didn't happen like that. So, CAT scans come back and they have detected bilateral lesions on my brain, both on the left and right hand side. But to get more info on what this means, I needed to be transferred to another hospital to have an MRI scan, because they can see the lesions, but they can't, I'm presuming, go in depth with what they are and what they're not, and all the other stuff that comes with that. Honestly, at this point, a mix of the sort of anxiety that's been fluttering throughout the week, the fact that I know something's not right, combined with the waiting, and then that announcement, which was a bit of a bombshell to me, being told that you've got lesions on your brain, because I am not medically inclined whatsoever. Some people might have a good idea of what that is when they hear it. I didn't. I just heard the phrase lesions on your brain. And really, in my head, the only thing that should be on my brain is brain. So I'm just... yeah. That was a shock, and that really upset me. And because of all of the things previously mentioned combined with that shock, I just started crying, because it was scary. Genuinely scary. especially when you don't know what a lesion on the brain is or what a lesion is full stop. But you're told you've had a scan done and they found something on your brain. I mean, I catastrophize at the best of times and the worst of times. So I was just running the gamut of what this could be, and it wasn't good. My brain was not behaving in any sense of the word that night. Anyway, there's more waiting to be done whilst I put together a transfer packet and a request to send me off to another hospital to have the MRI done. And yeah, as mentioned, at this point I'm just overwhelmed and I'm exhausted and I'm shocked and I just want to go home. I just really want to go home. I actually said to the doctor, can I do the MRI at a later date? Because I am just so tired. I just want to sleep. He says, you can. You know, you're free to do whatever you want. But I really do not advise that you go home. I advise you just go to the next hospital, get the MRI done, and just see where this takes you after the MRI. You need to address this sooner rather than later. So I get the transfer packet, the request has gone in, and we are off to hospital number 2. We arrive at hospital number 2 at about 1 or 2 a.m. at this point, and I explain a couple more times to a couple more people what brings me here, and I explain the process that occurred in hospital 1, despite bringing a transfer packet with notes in it. Yeah, at this point I'm scared, I'm shook, I'm running out of patience, and I'm running out of awakeness in my brain. I just want to just shut down completely. But I can't. So they take my vitals at hospital number 2. There's more waiting. And then eventually I go in for an MRI at about 3 a.m. More vitals taken, more waiting. And then eventually I'm told that hospital 2 doesn't have a neurology department and that I would have to head to hospital number 3, which does have a neurology department. And I'm given 2 options here. One of which is a 2-hour drive to Austin or a 30-minute drive to a place that would become hospital number 3. So, no-brainer, pun intended. We arrive at our third stop of the evening, or the morning, as it is at this point, about 7 in the morning or thereabouts. And at this point in time, the note-taking, recapping that I had done in preparation to record this episode and for prosperity, all of that has stopped. So I'm no longer going off my notes. Instead, I'm just going to have to go from my shitty memory. So we get to hospital number 3, and then we go through the rigors of admin, and then I'm basically taken to a room in the emergency room, or emergency section, whatever you want to call it, where vitals are taken for the umpteenth time. There's more waiting to be done. However, this time I'm doing my waiting within a bed, so I can dip in and out of consciousness with a bit more comfort and not just, randomly fall asleep for small pockets of time, sat upright with my head against some wallpaper or whatever. Eventually, I get moved to the room in which I'm going to be staying overnight because they're going to have to explore this further. I'm introduced to the room, introduced to it, like it's a date, like I'm being set up on a blind date with a hospital room. Anyway, I'm shown to the room, and then I'm taken down for another MRI. But because I've already had contrast from the previous MRI, they've got to wait a certain amount of time before they can administer it again and do another MRI. So back up to my new room, which I've just been introduced to. Morning comes, as does my second MRI. And as a bonus prize, I also head down for a lumbar puncture, aka a spinal tap. Now, at this point, my only reference for an actual spinal tap, not the fictitious mockumentary by Rob Reiner, is the procedure that Reagan has in The Exorcist, which is awful. Thankfully, medical practices have come a long way since the 70s, and I'm also not living inside of a film directed by the late, great, but somewhat maniacal William Friedkin. That doesn't even bear thinking about what that might be like. I'm having a lumbar puncture not because I've been possessed by Pazuzu, but because doctors want to rule out or confirm that I have MS, multiple sclerosis. I'm actually quite pleased I got that in one take. I've always had a trouble saying that word, but I think maybe because I have it now, I can say it easier. Oh, spoilers. Yeah, I have MS. Anticlimactic or what? Now, for those of you who are infinitely curious and don't know what MS is, or how it manifests, etc., you can get as deep into the weeds as you want in your own time. Again, I'm not going to unpack the ins and outs of this medical element. You've got the resources. But for a brief layperson's explanation, Johns Hopkins Medicine says, and I'm going to read from some notes here to make it a fish, or a fish-ish. Multiple sclerosis. Oh man, well, there you go. Multiple sclerosis is a long-lasting chronic disease of the central nervous system. It is thought to be an autoimmune disorder, a condition in which the body attacks itself by mistake. MS is an unpredictable disease that affects people differently. Some people with MS may have only mild symptoms. If you recall, if you're a long-term listener, you might remember that I did an episode with Dr. Kevin Payne, who has MS, and that was my first introduction to it. And if you want to get his experience, then yeah, I highly recommend you dive into the archives and listen to that. I haven't yet, I've been meaning to, because of the sitch, as it were, but I don't know. I don't think I've been brave enough to do that yet, but it's a fantastic story. His whole episode was fantastic to record. Anyway, I'm kind of digressing here, but definitely worth checking out the episode with Kevin Payne and learning how he got a grip on his MS by skydiving. Yeah. I have relapsing remitting MS, which, if you're going to have MS, that, I believe, from what I've heard, is the best kind to have. Essentially, people with relapsing remitting have flare-ups of the disease, otherwise known as flares, or relapses, and between these flares, you have periods of recovery, or remission. So, what I experienced back in November was a huge flare, big time, and right now, I'm in remission. And, if you are superstitious, go and knock on some wood for me. A part of me thinks that the thing that I was talking to you about that I had 7 or 8 years ago, whether it was an infection or labyrinthitis, was actually neither of those things, but perhaps it was my very first flare. I don't know. Maybe not. Truthfully, it doesn't matter. All that really matters is that the lumbar puncture and the data from my MRI and my CAT scan all point to the fact that I do have MS. So after the diagnosis, I stayed in hospital, and my total time in hospital was about just under a week, during which I had many more vitals taken, eye drops administered because my vision was still wonky AF. I had a number of blood samples extracted. I was basically a human pincushion with countless sore and tender spots. I also had a cannula fitted in, that was for 5 rounds of strong steroids, which were flushed into my system to bring the inflammation in my brain box all the way down. I didn't feel any side effects from the steroids, but they must have been strong, because they worked. Took a little while to kick in, but it worked. Like, the comparison before and after, night and day. Outside of dealing with the disorientation that comes with a prolonged hospital visit, I spent most of that week in bed trying to process my diagnosis. There was no burying my head in the sand with this one. As much as I didn't want it to be true, it was. And so my time in hospital was largely spent trying to level with that, trying to level with a new normal. Contemplating what adjustments I would need to make and how my life was about to change, and trying to wrap my head around the fact that my life was about to change. It was a difficult time for a lot of reasons, one of which was because having the diagnosis was a bit of a double-edged sword. On one hand, I didn't have the same fear that came with hearing the phrase lesions on your brain, because there wasn't that uncertainty to it, there wasn't that abstract nature to it, that vagueness, that open space to colour in your own interpretations and project your own fears and catastrophes. that was gone. Instead, I had a sense of solace and comfort with an actual diagnosis. Like, we've done the tests, this is what we found, this is what you have. So there is a sense of comfort in knowing, and you can move forward with knowing. But at the same time, it's not something I ever imagined having. As is the case all the time with this, you know. You just never expect these things. And when they happen, it just, it does a number on you. So in the quiet moments by myself in the hospital, where I wasn't propelled by shark mentality, where I had no option but to stop and sit and think and feel and steep in the time that I had, I moved through various states of mind and heart. There was a sense of optimism, whether it was a case of trying to just keep my head above water, or I found a genuine sense of positive momentum. I honestly don't know. But I remember reasonable stretches of calm and acceptance, and I think, as I mentioned, that comes with knowing what it is that you're dealing with, or at least having a name for it, for which you can dig into and research and learn about and make those steps forward. I also had a real flow of gratitude moving through me. And I want to take a moment of real sincerity to say that had my wife not been there with me, had she not been the anchor, the guiding light, the amazing pillar of support that she is in all facets, but particularly in that moment, in those days, in that week, had she not been there, I dread to think of how much harder that week would have been. Not to mention the subsequent weeks that followed, and still are following. I also want to say that my workplace has been fantastic. They were fantastic during my hospital stay. They've been fantastic with the post-diagnosis life that I'm living. And, you know, the people around me, friends, families, even acquaintances that know, I am extremely lucky to have a very strong, rigid and flexible support system with various arms. A lot of people don't have that, and so I'm trying, even in my most petulant, self-pitying moments, trying to cling at least one finger into that and just realize that, because without that, I don't know. I honestly don't. During the flow of gratitude in the hospital and afterwards, now, I mean, maybe not so much because it's more prominent in the hospital when you're in that moment, but still I will have moments, periods where I come to the realization that I am very fortunate that the lesions on my brain are and were not a symptom of something worse. And what I have is manageable. It's not easy, it's not pleasant, it's certainly not what I want, but it's manageable, for sure. On my last night in the hospital, the only night that I spent by myself because my wife is an absolute champion, I sat and I contemplated all of that and more. I sat and I pondered how this could have been worse, and that for a lot of people, some of which were probably in the same wing that I was of the same building, it's probably worse. A lot fucking worse. I also sat with a sense of uncertainty for the future, because although I have a name for what it is that I have, I know what it is I'm dealing with by name, and I can dig into it and take those steps forward. There is a real sense of uncertainty with the future, or at least there was. And not to tease too much, because it's coming in the next episode, we'll get into that next time. But yeah, sitting in the hospital on that last night, it was just a big haze of uncertainty was in the mix, as well as gratitude, as well as appreciation, as well as just reflection for other people. There was a sense of uncertainty. I mean, there's a sense of uncertainty about life in general, and I feel like I'm fairly, not even well equipped, I'm just used to uncertainty within my life. But this felt different, because this was an uncertainty that was going to require different skill set, a whole lot more learning and adjusting and adapting. And yeah, that in itself is an onion with many, many layers. But yeah, I sat with an abundance of feelings that last night. It is the 2nd of December 2023, and tonight is my 5th and final night here in hospital. And just shy of 3 weeks away from Christmas, I will be discharged with an early unwanted present, that is the diagnosis of multiple sclerosis. It's not what I wanted. It's not great, obviously. It certainly wasn't on my list to Santa Claus this year, but it is what it is. And I am trying to deal with it, and I think I'm doing a pretty good job so far. All things considered, it has been a shock. I was kind of blindsided by it, and I've been through a couple of emotions with it. And I'm still going through a couple of emotions with it. I feel like I've got a good handle on it for the most part, but, you know, it's a learning curve, and the immediate future is going to be a learning curve, and the long-term future is going to be a learning curve, because really, it's got so much uncertainty with it. I've also been taking moments to kind of just sit and think about other things as well. I am naturally programmed to kind of push people away somewhat, untrusting of people, and maybe there's a sense of feeling I'm undeserving of help and whatnot for some reason, of which there will be deeper roots to that. But yeah, my natural inkling is to push people away a lot of the time. And this week I have allowed people to get a little bit closer, to be supportive. I've needed it, to be honest. I found myself, it's not even like a choice, I've just accepted it because it's helped. People's outreach, people's support, and people's love has been very adamant the last few days. I honestly don't know what else to say at this point. I felt like coming into this I kind of had a bit of a head of steam to talk about it, but I feel like maybe I've talked about it enough inside of my own head. I really wanted to kind of give, I don't know what I wanted to give. I guess I just wanted to kind of reflect and record for preservation of this moment in time. You know, at this stage, you know, things are about to change. I don't know to what level, but I'm looking forward to going home, and I'm looking forward to kind of getting back into a sense of new normal, which it will be. And on that note, that's it for this episode. This has been good for me to be talking about publicly. It's been good to kind of get you into the loop with what's happening. I hope it's been of some value, as I always do with episodes. This one especially, though, perhaps you know someone, or perhaps you yourself have had the same diagnosis or a diagnosis and are grappling with that emotional beast yourself. If so, which I hope you're not, but on the off chance you are, or you know someone that is, I hope this can be of some help. Yeah. But that's it for this episode. Next week, as I mentioned, the whole thing of a bit of certainty in a time of uncertainty, we're going to unpack that in the next episode as we hit the road to Mexico. and a potentially life-altering treatment for me and my MS diagnosis. Now, how's that for a cliffhanger? As always, thank you for listening. Look after yourselves, look after each other, and until next time, keep it dimed out.